If you've been on this planet long enough, you've probably heard of the dimension known as the Twilight Zone, a black and white sci-fi anthology show created by one of my favorite writers, Rod Serling, which ran for 5 seasons on CBS from 1959 to 1964, with an incredibly recognizable theme song written by one of my favorite composers, Bernard Herrmann, which I can't play for copyright reasons. Serling also hosted the show, as well as produced on and wrote 92 of the original show's 156 episodes. Using the sci-fi genre, Serling created memorable stories which usually focused heavily on issues that other shows at the time didn't even want to touch, including prejudice, the dangers of mass hysteria, the threat of nuclear war, McCarthyism, and fascism. And most of said episodes always ended in mind-blowing plot twists and cliffhangers that would leave viewers shook. Honestly, it's one of the greatest television shows of all time. Hell, at the time of this recording, there is a Twilight Zone theme park attraction at Disney World. However, we will not be talking too much more about the Twilight Zone, because on the road of Rod Serling's career, we're going to be getting off at the intersection, past Requiem for a Heavyweight and the original Planet of the Apes, to take a sharp right and stop at what is known as Night Gallery. Where the Twilight Zone was half an hour long, including commercials and excluding season 4, one story per episode, and mainly stayed in the science fiction genre, Night Gallery was more horror-centric, an hour long, and typically had either 2 to 3 to 4 stories per episode, except for season 3, where episodes were cut to half an hour with only 1 or 2 stories. And of course, not to mention the gruesome experience of terror in color. Just like Twilight Zone, Night Gallery also had a rotating door of guest stars, like Vincent Price, John Astin, Mark Hamill, Agnes Moorehead, Burgess Meredith, the Bride of Frankenstein herself, Elsa Lanchester, and Grandpa Munster, among many others. Night Gallery aired for 3 seasons on NBC from 1970 to 1973, Serling writing 35 out of the 98 stories. There are also stories written by horror legends such as Richard Matheson and Robert Bloch. The premise of Night Gallery is that you would find yourself with Rod Serling wearing his suit and tie in a dark and dreadful art gallery filled with grotesque paintings, in which he is the curator and tour guide. A specific portrait, in which Serling is delivering his chilling monologue in front of, is tied to the story which is about to be presented. A frozen moment of a nightmare, as Serling puts it. And he would do this before every horror story in the show. All these paintings were painted by Thomas J. Wright, who would later go on to be a top TV producer and director. Although not as recognized as The Twilight Zone, those who have experienced Night Gallery are aware that there are many memorable frights to endure within this series. And honestly, the show is a really fun watch I recommend to anybody who's into horror, Rod Serling, or The Twilight Zone. There are episodes of this show that get dark. And once again, Serling pushed the limits of what horror he could put on television during prime time. Just be aware there are also a lot of stories which teeter being between campy, which I'm not gonna knock because I love campy, and then just straight up pure ridiculousness. Most likely due to the many creative differences between Serling and executives at the time, which eventually led to the show's cancellation despite its rating successes. Doesn't that sound familiar? If there was anything that Serling hated just as much as war and bigotry, it was entertainment executives. But that is exactly why I'm starting this series, so we can discuss all of it. So please join me in Perusing the Night Gallery, starting with the complete 1969 pilot episode, which I'm gonna admit straight away is a pretty damn good pilot. This episode consists of 3 unnerving stories, all written by Serling, and it's a must-watch for those wanting to get into Night Gallery. It involves an extraordinary actress who has been in horror movies herself, the directorial debut of one of the most iconic directors in cinema history, and a fun yet soft introductory into 1970s horror. All 3 of the paintings in the pilot episode were created by Jarlasoff Jerry Geber. Before we get started, please remember to like this video, subscribe, and click on the little bell so you'll never miss a channel update from me. You can also listen or read my own horror anthology series, Queer Goal, on queergoalpodcast.com and anywhere you get your podcasts, including right here on YouTube. As a heads up, there will be spoilers in this video. So if you don't want to be spoiled, use the chapter markers to go past each individual story within the episode, or pause the video, go watch the episode, and come back.
Our initial offering, a small Gothic item in blacks and grays. A piece of the past known as the family crypt. This one we call simply the cemetery.
Up first is a story called The Cemetery, which was directed by Boris Sagal, who is the father of actress and singer Katie Sagal. I also read that he met a brutal demise when he was decapitated by a helicopter on the set of one of his projects. And the painting for this story, which beautifully captures the Gothic atmosphere, has a huge significance to the plot itself. We open on a creepy mansion, the same one from the painting, and inside we find a man named William Hendricks who's recently had a stroke, which has left him housebound and unable to take care of himself. He is aided by his longtime butler, Osmond Portafoy, and we see that once a marvelous painter, Hendricks is now unable to do what he loved. And this short little scene made me so fucking sad. Shortly after Portafoy comes downstairs, he runs into Hendrix's douche canoe of a nephew, Jeremy Evans. Jeremy begins to monologue about how him and his now deceased mother, Hendrix's sister, used to dream about living a life of luxury. And according to Hendrix's will, since his mother is now gone and he is now Hendrix's only living relative, Jeremy is entitled to his uncle's estate and fortune in the event of his passing. I have to admit, though, that I had to rewind this monologue a few times because all I could focus on was how Jeremy persistently makes it known that he is aware of Portafoy's name.
Portafoy, that is wasteful, Portafoy. Portafoy, did you Portafoy? Portafoy. Tell me something, Portafoy. Portafoy, 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 Portafoy.
Seriously, I hear him say it in my dreams. Anyway, Jeremy decides that he can't wait any longer as he wants that rich life yesterday. So he decides to kill his uncle by locking his wheelchair in front of an open window, which overlooks the family cemetery, despite the doctor's orders to keep him away from drafts. And when his uncle unfortunately does pass away from this, he instructs the lawyer that he wants the money and estate immediately. And Portafoy asks to stay on and work under Jeremy for some reason. That's not suspicious. And this is when Jeremy begins to notice something strange about one of the portraits his uncle painted. It begins to change, although only Jeremy sees it. His uncle isn't even completely buried a few feet away from the front door yet, before Jeremy's already inviting women over for sex. The portrait again changes to show a casket coming up from the grave. In a fit of fear, Jeremy throws the portrait into a fire and destroys it. But when he goes back to look, the portrait is still hanging on the wall. And still, Portafoy is completely blind to it, and this causes Jeremy to lash out. And this scene and Portafoy's delivery of "you burned me" just gets a laugh out of me every time.
And there it is on the wall. As usual.
Imagination, sir.
Imagination.
You burned me. Deliberately.
Oh, no, Portafoy. That was your imagination.
Because of this, Portafoy announces that he quits and he's leaving immediately in favor of staying temporarily at a nearby hotel. The idea of staying alone in the house absolutely scares the hell out of Jeremy, as he begs Portafoy to stay. But Portafoy's mind is made up, and as Jeremy insists that Portafoy agree with him that death is permanent, Portafoy warns him that hate is stronger than death. Dun dun dun. One of the things that's hardest for me to ignore in this story is how quick everything is, from the uncle's murder to Jeremy taking over the estate and money, and Jeremy sleeping in presumably the same bed and the same sheets that his uncle died in. I mean, he moved into the room before his uncle's body was even removed. He's also clearly inviting women over for rendezvous before the uncle's even completely buried. So was there time to clean the deathbed before he put the bed in use for himself? These are important questions, people. We then enter into the climax of the story. And man, with the music and sound effects and the cut scenes from the portrait to the window and the doors, it's awesome. Jeremy calls the police because he believes his uncle is approaching the house, as the painting has again changed to reflect this as he hears footsteps and a banging against the door. Absolutely terrified, he grabs the portrait of his uncle off the wall, loses his balance, and accidentally falls down the stairs, which kills him instantly. The person at the door is revealed to be, drumroll please, Portafoy! Which brings us to the twist of the episode, in which Serling is always known for. We learn that Portafoy hired an artist to paint many different versions of the painting in order to either kill Jeremy or have him appear insane and admitted into a psych ward. Why? Because in Hendrix's will, it is stated that if there are no surviving members of the family 6 months after his death, then the estate and the fortune would go to Portafoy. So this brings us to the end of the story, where Portafoy lives happily ever after, and wait, there is another plot twist. The painting has changed, and it depicts Jeremy coming out of his grave and approaching the door while footsteps are heard and a rattling of the doorknob. And while Portafoy is screaming, the door eerily opens, and the story fades to black. I know there are many out there who don't like the ambiguous endings, but I absolutely adore them. I feel like they make you continually think about the story and its characters on a deeper level than if the ending were clean cut. I mean, who was at the door? Is it true that hate is stronger than death and something supernatural is taking place? Is it another trick? Did Jeremy maybe suspect someone was after him and faked his death, and now he's getting revenge on Portafoy? Or is Portafoy maybe feeling guilt for Jeremy's death and the happening events are only going on in his own mind? Overall, this story is one of the best in Night Gallery, and is a hell of a way to kick off the show with being the first story of the pilot. Clearly the plot is a play on Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, and Serling's writing beautifully captures the trepidation and terror while taking the painting trope and making it his own. I enjoyed the cast, with special kudos to Roddy McDowall as he played the greedy nephew Jeremy. It's not lost on me his ability to go from Jeremy being pure evil at times to them flawlessly shifting to the moments of fright where you almost feel sorry for him. It almost feels like the character regrets his own devious actions. McDowall had many accolades under his belt, especially in the horror genre, but this wasn't his first time working on a Rod Serling project. He appeared in the 1960 Twilight Zone episode People Are Alike All Over, and he played the characters of Cornelius and Caesar in the original Planet of the Apes series, in which Serling was one of the writers of the screenplay for the first film. Although Bernard Herrmann didn't have any part in Night Gallery, and instead all the music in the pilot was composed by William Goldenberg, the music was still pretty good. And it added to the dark atmosphere of the story, and I love the tension-building cinematography. If I had to give it a rating, it deserves a flat-out 5 out of 5 for Night Gallery.
Auger d'Art number 2. A portrait. Its subject, Miss Claudia Menlo. A blind queen who reigns in a carpeted penthouse on Fifth Avenue. An imperious, predatory dowager who will soon find a darkness blacker than blindness. This is her story. The
second story of the pilot episode is probably the most famous, and for very good reasons. It's called The Eyes, and it's directed by a little-known director by the name of Steven Spielberg. Yes, that same Steven Spielberg behind beloved classics like E.T., Jurassic Park, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Indiana Jones, and many, 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 many more films. Considered one of the greatest film directors ever, Steven Spielberg made his professional debut at the age of 22 while directing this story of Night Gallery, and only a few years later going on to direct 1975's Jaws. Yeah, I'm telling the truth, people. He would come back and do another Night Gallery episode in season 1's Make Me Laugh. And if the woman in the painting looks familiar to you, it's because she's also a huge icon in her own right. Yes, we are talking about the legendary Joan Crawford. Those in the horror community would know her from 1927's silent film The Unknown, starring opposite Lon Chaney Sr., the 1962 camp classic Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, starring opposite her decades-long rival Bette Davis, 1964's Straight Jacket, 1965's I Saw What You Did, and 1967's Berserk, among a few other ones, especially Trog. We kinda don't want to talk about Trog. Sorry. I'm trying to hold back on focusing so much about Joan, but I have to be honest, I'm one of those huge queers who's a big fan of hers. I even got a book, man. Look at that. I got a book. And she may be a little queer in her own right, when she may or may not have a fling with Marlene Dietrich. I promise though that when we get to the story overview, I'll have some behind the scenes production tea involving her. So I'll save it till then. Actually, The Eyes is the only story from the pilot I could find any behind the scenes production stuff on. For now, she is our main character in this story, Claudia Menlo, who lives in an apartment building on 5th Avenue in New York City. The catch is she is rich as hell, had this apartment building built just for her, and she's the only tenant in the building as she lives as a queen in her luxurious penthouse. Which is enough there, honestly, to show how much of a true bitch she is. All the homeless people in this country, especially in New York City, and she has this building constructed just for her, all for herself. That's evil rich people stuff right there. Claudia has been blind all her life. This is where the episode starts as her doctor, Frank Heatherton, pays her a visit. She tells him that she feels jaded by life and God for making her blind, and she insists to the doctor that she wants an illegal and controversial surgery which has only been tested on animals. She wants to get an optic nerve transplant, which will maybe give her roughly 12 hours of sight. In exchange, the donor of the optic nerve will be blind for the rest of their life. And she says she has found a donor who only wants $9,000. This immediately throws me off. This is one of the richest people wanting your ability to see, and you want only $9,000 from her? Due to inflation, that $9,000 would be worth today like $77,766.59. I had a calculator for that. But still, that's not going to help them then. They should have asked for at least enough to be set for life. They are soon to become disabled, and unfortunately most disabled people live in poverty. Actually, when I think about it, couldn't you have used a recently deceased donor? I mean, their optic nerve probably still works, right? I know I had a shitty time with mine before I took medication. This would also make it the second time that Crawford has played a character wanting risky eye surgery. The first being 1952's The Woman is Dangerous. Naturally, the doctor is disgusted and refuses to do the surgery. That is until Claudia whips out a manila envelope containing some scathing blackmail, which Heatherton will know will ruin his career as well as his marriage if it should be leaked out. So he accepts to do it, and she puts one final nail down to let it be known that the only person or thing she cares about is herself, as any other person is just an object for her to use. Fucking narcissist. I've had enough of narcissists, I swear. Even if it is Joan Crawford.
I want to see something. Trees, concrete, buildings, grass, airplanes, color!
Get out before I kill you!
What's that for?
I do that in all my pictures.
We then meet that donor, who only wants $9,000, being tormented on a merry-go-round in the park. He is Sidney Resnick, who owes $9,000 in gambling debts, to the man in the trench coat and hat who says that if he doesn't get the money soon, he's going to kill Resnick. Trust me, vertigo and dizziness is not at all fun, but why they decided to meet up at the park to do this threatening exchange is beyond me. In the next scene, as he signs the contract to perform the surgery in front of Dr. Heatherton and the lawyer, he says that he's grateful for all that he's been able to see in his life. That night, they perform the surgery at a private hospital with voiceovers of each of them speaking and some cool creepy shots of their eyes. This is actually the last we see of Resnick, but it's totally okay because he goes on to be Sheriff Tupper in Cabot Cove. Afterwards, Dr. Heatherton warns her to take precautions as she sits in front of her gallery of art with her eyes bandaged. She discards Dr. Heatherton as she claims that he is no longer of use to her. And as he departs, extremely upset with himself for having performed the surgery, he flicks on the switch to the chandelier. Don't let the Phantom of the Opera see that chandelier. Here it is now. The moment Claudia has waited for all of her life. We're gripped by the tension as she spins the gauze off her head and pulls it away from her eyes. They adjust to the light of the chandelier, and then, BAM! Everything is black. She kicks and bangs against everything in the penthouse as she cries and screams in frustration, believing that the doctor had failed her. At first, we're made to believe that the surgery didn't work, but actually, it's a plot twist in the form of a good old-fashioned New York City blackout. And I know that some may be thinking, isn't this a plot hole? All she sees is black darkness. But shouldn't she be able to see the lights from down below flashing of all the cars on the street? I did think about this and seeing that the lights on the cars don't seem to be nearly as bright as on cars of today. And she resides in a penthouse, which is the very top of the building. I do believe that would have been likely that she didn't see the lights, especially if she didn't look down. At least this is the explanation I'm going to stick to until I hear a better one. The next morning, as the sun rises in the early hours, Claudia awakes and sees it, and we hear more of her voiceover. But as her vision starts to fade, she bangs harder on the already damaged window until the glass shatters, and presumably she goes through and falls to her death. Okay, wow, we have a lot to unpack here. While this story wasn't a supernatural horror like The Cemetery and more of a sci-fi and psychological horror, it was still an enjoyable story, made more fun by Spielberg's direction, and cool scenes throughout the story of eyes, statues, and shattered glass. Granted, the budget for this pilot was low, yet he certainly made the most of what was given to him. And can you imagine what it must have been like for a 22-year-old newbie like Steven Spielberg to have to work with the legendary Joan Crawford, especially with the reputation she had at the time of being challenging to work with. I do want to add that for anyone who knows the history of Joan, knows that most likely she was only a sad woman who acted out in anger. And she definitely deserved to be treated a lot better than she was, especially towards the end of her life and career. She participated and donated to countless different charities over her lifetime, even leaving what money she had left when she died to said charities. I would recommend checking out the 2017 FX series Feud, Betty and Joan for more on the history of Joan and her rivalry with Bette Davis, who was apparently first considered for the role of Claudia in this story, but turned it down. Whether Joan was aware about that fact before she agreed to take the part, I don't know. This was one of Joan's final acting performances before she died in 1977, and she delivered. I'm pretty sure this is the best she looked during the last decade of her career. There was no need for her to do Trog or that one episode of The Sixth Sense. Crawford just oozes class, even when playing the different facets of this horrible character. And she may not have Bette Davis eyes, but she certainly has a piercing set of her own. She also showed faultless chemistry in the tense scenes with the character Heatherton, played by Barry Sullivan, whom she also starred with in the 1955 film Queen Bee. And of course, nobody can forget Tom Bosley, and how well his childlike character complements Joan's. While Joan is incredibly selfish, Bosley is selfless, and grateful for what he's been able to see and what he has now. And this difference just elevates the plot. When it comes to how Joan was behind the scenes, there are a few definite facts, but a whole lot of things come down to he said, she said, they said. Such as the reasoning for why there's so much voiceover in the story being because she was unwell for the majority of the shoot. But Joan said herself in an interview that she worked 19 hours just the first day. And honestly, the voiceover added to the suspense of the story. What we do know is that apparently Joan didn't want Spielberg to be the director of this segment, as she wanted a more accomplished director, but eventually she submitted. According to Spielberg himself, he said that she was incredibly kind to him and treated him like a king. In fact, they remained friends until she passed. She took her role as a blind woman incredibly serious. Although I do have to admit that I'm not particularly a fan of able-bodied people playing disabled people. And the biggest issue during production she seemed to have was memorizing Rod Serling's lines, an issue that apparently Barry Sullivan had as well. Rod can get lengthy, I admit that. But she still seemed to not have any beef with Serling, as she is reported to have sent him a telegram congratulating him on the Planet of the Apes when it was first released. To sum it up, it was a great story and I love Joan Crawford, and I'll look for any excuse to talk about her.
And now, the final painting. The last of our exhibit has to do with one Josef Strobe, a Nazi war criminal hiding in South America. A monster who wanted to be a fisherman. This is his story.
The third and final story of the pilot episode starts out a little differently than the rest, as we don't see the associated painting. But by the end of the segment, you'll understand that it's for a good reason. Here we meet a man named Josef Strobe, a Nazi hiding out in South America while dressed as a sailor. I would look so handsome in that outfit. And in case you're one of those people who don't realize this, I'll let you know that Nazis are bad people! And of course, we have to top it off with the good old villain with a disfigurement trope. While on the run, he's still being haunted by his evil past, and at the same time being hunted down by Israeli agents. It can be argued that the story could have gone with Strobe seeking redemption from his past, which he regrets. Human psychology has proven through studies and even historical events like the Holocaust that someone considered good and normal can turn monstrous through the means of authoritative figures in environmental and systematic conditions. But the problem with that here is that Strobe is still a dick, and he has no remorse for what he's done. He's just flat out a horrible human being. While being chased by these detectives, he hops on a bus to get away. And as a piece of advice, if you're in hiding, maybe don't sit in the back of the bus in front of the biggest window looking guilty AF. I did enjoy this little chase scene though, with flashes of jolting unsteady camera work. It had enough of an effect that it didn't make me motion sick, so that was a plus. The bus stops out front of a museum and he rushes inside. He comes across a Holocaust survivor named Bloom as he's moved by a gruesome concentration camp painting of an agonized man being crucified. And Bloom tells Strobe that he watched his friend die in the same way, while at the camps. He believes he recognizes Strobe from the camps, but Strobe lies that he's not German and blows him off. Strobe instead goes over to a painting of a fisherman in his rowboat and immediately falls in love with it, longing to live his Hemingway dream of peace. A little later, he talks to his prostitute neighbor about this and the suggestion that if he puts all of his will into the painting, he could become one with the painting and no longer have to be on the run. His neighbor immediately disses his notion by telling him that he doesn't have a conscience or a soul for such things as peace and immortality. Burn! Strobe goes to a bar where people are singing, and while drunk, he joins in singing a German anthem. And he ends up causing a scene before he leaves. Unfortunately for him, Bloom was at the bar, and peacefully confronts Strobe outside, telling him that he knows that he was the cruel guard at the concentration camp, who decided whether people lived or died upon entry. And as he shows Strobe his injuries, he also tells him that he's hardly changed at all. Angered at being exposed and in fear of Bloom talking, he kills him and makes a run for it. Kitty! We get another much longer chase scene. I do like how quirky and swanky the music can be in this story, and it adds to the suspense of the chase scenes, but this one does have some questionable freeze cuts that I don't particularly understand. But the chase does ultimately take us back to the museum, where we see its different exhibits. Strobe makes a beeline for where the fisherman painting was, and kneels in front of it with his eyes closed, and he begs and prays to be allowed in the painting. And when he opens his eyes, he screams in terror.
Please, please, God, Christ, anyone, get me into the picture. I must get into the picture.
We are immediately taken then to the point of view of the agents, who are told that the fisherman painting was taken away, and in its place is now the concentration camp painting, which we can clearly tell that Strobe is now in. The episode ends with the men hearing moaning and crying, but not being able to know where it's coming from. Although we all know that it's Strobe getting the true immortality that he deserves. Now, if you only visited the Night Gallery just for the horror, then this may be one that you want to skip. Granted, the only horror moments in the episode would be the ending and the crucifixion painting, as well as the underlying current of the Holocaust, and those murdered and tortured in the concentration camps. The execution of the story does feel a little sluggish at times. However, I would still say that it's definitely worth checking out. I feel as though the story is a powerful one, which is led by Richard Kiley's performance as Strobe. Now, I am big on punching Nazis, but Kiley is so moving in his role, you can't help but actually feel sympathy for the man. I also did enjoy the experimental camera work in this segment, like the talking through the wall scene and the various shots taken throughout the chases. All in all, it's exactly Serling to end this pilot episode on a note with a sense of justice. Congrats on surviving the frights of all 3 stories of the Night Gallery pilot. If you've gotten anything from this video, I hope it was a fun time and a better appreciation of the work of Rod Serling. 2 of the biggest things you may have noticed about his writing is that he was the king of plot twists. Almost every story he's written has included a plot twist. In some stories, even double plot twists. I wouldn't say all of them are the best things ever, but at least the 3 we've seen were definitely on the better side of that spectrum. The other thing is that Serling was keen on morality, and it shows with how every single villain in each of these stories got their due comeuppance. But I'm interested in hearing from you. Please leave a comment down below about what you thought about this pilot episode of Night Gallery. Which stories were your favorite? What stories and/or episodes would you like to see me cover next? If you think I would in fact look handsome in that sailor suit, even if you just want to comment the word algorithm, I would deeply appreciate it. And if you'd like to check out my queer horror anthology podcast, Queer Goal, please visit queergoalpodcast.com or anywhere you listen to your podcasts, including right here on YouTube. Thank you so much for perusing the Night Gallery with me. I'm the Queer Goal, Adriana Oyster, and until next time.
Portafoy. That is wasteful, Portafoy. Portafoy. Did you Portafoy? Portafoy. Tell me something, Portafoy. 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 Portafoy.
Get out before I kill you!